This is Pintaland, a 7-part series written and performed by me, Noah Diamond. Part 3, A Very Brody Passover.
Illu nostan lonu es ha-Torah v'lo itisonu le'yeretz Yisroel dayenu da yenu da yenu da yenu da yenu
My great-grandmother Jenny, who came to America in 1905 to recover from the death of her sister Sarah Esther, had 2 daughters. Her first daughter, Sarah, was born in 1918. Sarah served as a nurse lieutenant in Patton's Third Army, then married Joe Brody, became a teacher, had 3 kids, and lived in Bloomfield, Connecticut. Jenny's second daughter, Esther or Estelle, but everyone knew her as Red, was born in 1921. Red was an activist and a revolutionary who married Joe Lerner, became a teacher, had 3 kids, and lived in Greenwich Village in downtown Manhattan. And on the big holidays, Red and Joe Lerner would pack up the kids, their youngest was my mother, Cindy, and travel to Sarah and Joe Brody's house in Bloomfield, Connecticut, because for our family this was the holiest site in Judaism. That's approximately how I got here. Sarah and Joe Brody had 3 sons, and their oldest son's best friend was my father, Steve Diamond. I assumed everything about that beige Brody house on Brewer Drive in Bloomfield was an effect of Judaism. The aluminum siding, just like the temple in Jerusalem. Even the basketball hoop in the driveway. I was probably 10 years old before I realized that basketball was not specifically a Jewish thing. The house was surrounded by weeping willows, so I concluded that these trees must be Jewish. I mean, look, they're weeping. These trees are depressed, a feeling reinforced by the presence of a cemetery with Hebrew on the headstones, right over the hill from the Brody's backyard, as though a community of Orthodox ghosts was keeping an eye on that house. Even the fact that they lived on Brewer Drive. Brewer, Brew, Hebrew. That's where the Hebrews live. Upon entering the house, you confronted 2 half staircases, one going down, one going up. At the bottom of the down staircase, immediately visible when you walked in, was an Art Nouveau poster with a black background and the words, "Love one another." The poster was a survivor from a store briefly owned and operated by my parents before my time in Worcester, Massachusetts. They sold posters, incense, Indian clothing, and other hippie equipment. It lasted from 1969 to 1970, and my parents called it the Great Mandela after the song by Peter, Paul, and Mary.
Take your place, son, the Great Mandela.
The Great Mandela foundered on the seas of capitalism, but my early years were full of artifacts from its voyage, like little buttons that said "Make love, not war," and "Save water, shower with a friend," and this "Love one another" poster that was always the first thing I saw upon entering Temple Brody. If you go up the stairs from the front door, in front of you is the kitchen, with its limitless output of Jewish standards along with Sarah's macrobiotic experiments, and its cabinets carefully labeled meat and dairy. On your right is a continuous space encompassing the dining room and the living room. Off the dining room is an outdoor deck where every autumn Uncle Joe would build the sukkah, a sort of walled hut covered with leaves for the harvest holiday of Sukkot, or Sukkos, or, as we sometimes liked to call it, Suckass. This landing area, up the stairs from the front door, is where the Sabbath candles are lit and the menorah. But for me, any time I stood there, the lighting of candles and praying in Hebrew were mere background to the focus of my interest. A series of 12 tiles hanging on the wall, bearing brilliantly colorful dreamscapes. Years later, I would learn that these were the work of Marc Chagall, based on the stained glass windows he made for the Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem, representing the 12 tribes of Israel, and that they were a common sight on the walls of Jewish homes from the 1960s onward. I didn't know any of this, but I loved looking at them, and I'm certain I had a more transcendent experience staring into the mind of Marc Chagall than I would have had concentrating on the prayers. It is always 4:00 p.m. at the Brody's house. Aunt Sarah is always in the kitchen, where hundreds of things are happening. There is almost no time when Sarah is not simultaneously cooking, eating, and talking. Uncle Joe wanders in and out of the scene, greeting guests as he notices them.
Hello, Cindy. Hey, Joshua.
And asking Sarah where his jacket is.
My jacket.
Sarah responds by reminding him to vacuum.
I'll vacuum.
Uncle Joe is very loud and he doesn't hear well, so if you're talking to him, you have to be very loud too.
Are you managing? How is school?
It's fine.
What?
It's fine.
What are you studying?
Well, you know, English, math, science.
What? You're studying science?
Yes, I'm studying science.
You like science?
Sure, I guess I like science.
What?
I guess I like science.
Well, that's all right.
Uncle Joe is looking spiffy tonight. Thin gray hair neatly combed, yarmulke perfectly placed, light blue button-down, dark blue tie, medium blue sweater vest, navy blue pleated slacks. Because he has a big show tonight. It's the first night of Passover, 1980-something, and various aunts and uncles and cousins and friends are arriving for the seder. 20 or 30 people are all crammed in together at this table that's connected to another table. At the head of the table is Rabbi Joe Brody. The primary source for the Brody Seder is the popular standard since 1949, the Rabbi Nathan Goldberg Haggadah, with the red and yellow flimsy paper cover blotted with decades of Manischewitz wine stains. There is a well-worn copy of the Goldberg Haggadah at every place setting, and if another 30 people suddenly walked in, Sarah and Joe would somehow have enough Haggadahs for them too. Besides the book, there are numerous photocopied, typewritten papers equally stained and weathered from years of service, containing supplementary material. So we're all sitting at this long table, except Sarah, who is always on her feet, always moving, and always somehow present in every room of the house simultaneously. Everyone is talking, 12 conversations at once.
Give it to me and I'll give it a hug.
Who's in school?
You know, is anybody even
damn long?
Oh, that's very good.
Happy Passover. Are they going there?
Until Uncle Joe calls us to order and favors us with his opening remarks.
Everyone welcome and happy Pesach. Is everyone okay? You managing? There's a lot to manage, right? Our lives are filled with important business. We have work and school and every responsibility, every entanglement, every transaction requires our effort and our enthusiasm. And this is as it should be. But now is the time to put all of this aside, put it in your pocket, and come together to be among family and friends, and tell stories and sing songs and eat good food and gather here together to celebrate, to remember, to commemorate, and to elucidate and to tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt. Noah, you were in a play. I didn't get a ticket. How come I never get a ticket?
Here's Aunt Sarah, very busy with soup, but popping into the room to say, "Joe, get on with it already. By the time he starts the seder, the Messiah will be here." Now at this point, the candles have been lit, and any leavened bread in the house has been disposed of, perhaps even symbolically burned in accordance with rabbinic law. So the first real event of the seder is the Kiddush, the prayer over the wine. The first of 4 cups of wine the Haggadah commands us to drink at specific times throughout the seder. The kids drink grape juice, and maybe some of the adults do too. On the other hand, some of the adults, and maybe a kid or two, have also concluded that if our faith requires that we drink 4 cups of wine to sanctify the seder, and we know it's going to be a long night, we might as well find out how sanctified we can get. The prayer is delivered in Hebrew by Uncle Joe, or possibly by one of his 3 sons.
Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, B'rei
Let's turn on the subtitles.
Blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the world, creator of the fruit of the vine, who has chosen us of all people. No kidding, this is right out of the Goldberg. Us of all people. Exalting us by hallowing us with your commandments. In your love, you have given us feasts of happiness and seasons of joy. This festival, season of our freedom, a sacred occasion, a remembrance of the Exodus from Egypt. Blessed are you, Lord, who sanctifies Israel and our festivals. In texts like the Haggadah, the term Israel often refers not to a place, but to a people, wherever they may be. But don't worry, that's not going to cause any kind of confusion at any time. Next, we eat something green, like parsley, dipped in salt water. The parsley represents the springtime harvest. The salt water represents the tears of our ancestors. That's right, operator, the tears of our ancestors. For anyone keeping track, so far we've been at the table for 20 minutes, and we've had 1 cup of wine and 1 sprig of salty parsley. And now we will look at matzah. Matzah is a big, basically tasteless cracker, unleavened, without yeast. Its symbolic significance is that supposedly when the early Israelites fled Egypt, they left in a hurry and did not have time to let their bread rise. I always imagined Sarah and Joe as the early Israelites.
Sarah, Moses is here. He's going to lead us out of Egypt.
We'll go in an hour, Joe. I'm waiting for the bread to rise.
What?
An hour. The bread, it has to rise. We'll go in an hour. We'll take the bread with us. It's very nice bread.
We don't have an hour, Sarah. Pharaoh's army is coming. Let's go.
But we won't have what to eat.
We'll get something on the way.
On the way? In the desert we'll get something? What can you eat in the desert? Sand?
What?
Sand?
What?
You can't eat sand, Joe.
I don't want to eat sand, Sarah. I want to flee the land of Egypt.
All right, we'll take the dough with us. We don't have time for it to rise, but it'll bake under the hot sun, and it'll be like a cracker.
What?
A cracker. It'll be like a cracker.
It'll be like a cracker?
Yes, Joe, a cracker.
A cracker. A cracker.
Back in Bloomfield, 1980-something. Joe has a plate in front of him. On the plate, wrapped in cloth, are 3 pieces of matzah. He takes out the middle matzah, and he says,
"This is matzah, the bread of affliction, which our forefathers ate in the land of Egypt. All who are hungry, let them come and eat. All who are needy, let them come and celebrate the Passover with us. Now we are here. Next year, may we be in the land of Israel. Now we are slaves. Next year, may we be free.
So there we have one of the nicest passages in the Haggadah. All who are hungry, let them come and eat, followed immediately by some of my least favorites. When I was a kid, my feelings here were, well, I don't really want to go to Israel, and what is this present tense, we are slaves business? This fed my ambivalence about the homeland, a topic who knows we may return to. But in 1980-something, my parents explained it to me as a metaphor. Maybe next year in Jerusalem can mean next year wherever you would most like to be. Uncle Joe breaks the middle matzah in half and puts one half back on the plate. The other half he sets aside. It is called the afikomen. Later he will hide it somewhere in the house for the kids to find. The hunt for the afikomen was always hotly contested. There was even a reward, a quarter. It went up to $1 after the revolt of '87. Afikomen means dessert, and supposedly this was devised to keep the kids interested. But why anyone would get excited about the idea of more matzah for dessert is beyond me.
And now, it's time for the 4 questions,
Typically asked by the youngest person or people at the table. Why is this night different from all other nights? Is followed by 4 more detailed inquiries, because we're Jews and everything has to be complicated. 1. On all other nights, we eat leavened or unleavened bread. On this night, why do we eat matzah? 2. On all other nights, we eat herbs of any kind. On this night, why do we eat bitter herbs? 3. On all other nights, we do not dip our herbs even once. On this night, why do we dip them twice? 4. On all other nights, we eat our meals in any manner. On this night, why do we recline? You know, they are simply not very good questions. Don't you think we could cover all the symbolic food at once and maybe deal with a few other things? Uncle Joe uncovers the matzah and casually remarks,
We were slaves of Pharaoh in Egypt, and the eternal our God brought us out from there with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. If God had not brought out our forefathers from Egypt, then even we, our children, and our children's children might still have been enslaved to Pharaoh in Egypt. Therefore, even if we were all wise, all men of understanding,
or women of understanding. That was a gentle but firm correction from my mother. All evening, whenever the Haggadah tries to get away with universal masculine nouns and pronouns, we will revise it in real time.
and even if we were all old and well learned in the Torah, it would still be our duty to tell the story of the departure from Egypt. And the more one tells about the departure from Egypt, the more one is to be praised.
So, everyone got that? You simply can't say too much about the departure from Egypt. Now, continuing with the theme of curious young people, we come to this bit about the 4 sons. Okay, there's the wise son who wants to know the meaning of all these Passover customs, the wicked son, or more recently, the contrary son, these are known as the Goldberg variations, who says, "What's the meaning of this to you?" The simple son who asks, I don't know, what is this? And the son who does not even know how to ask. The book helpfully offers ways of explaining Passover to each of these fellas. But this is not great either. First of all, the wise, wicked, and simple sons are all asking the same thing, and the son who can't ask is still getting the same answer. Second, are we really comfortable throwing around judgments about wicked and simple children? This was part of the Haggadah that my family skipped, though Joe Brody saw that it was included in another form, a musical form. That's right, we're going to please turn to our typewritten, photocopied, dog-eared, wine-stained supplementary materials. Now, I grew up believing that this song could only possibly exist within the walls of the Brody house on Brewer Drive in Bloomfield. But it turns out the lyric was written by the poet and playwright Ben Aronin in 1948, and this thing is all over the internet. Like all traditional Jewish songs, this one is set to the tune of My Darling Clementine.
Said the father to his children, at the seder you will dine. You will eat your fill of matzah, you will drink 4 cups of wine. Said the wise son to his father, will you please explain the laws of the customs?
Oh, for God's sake, it goes on, and surely you get the idea. But I do want to give you the 2 verses about the wicked son, because they really used to haunt me.
Then did sneer the son so wicked, what does all this mean to you? And the father's voice was bitter as his grief and anger grew. If yourself you don't consider as a son of Israel, then to you this has no meaning. You could be a slave as well. Then the symbol...
That's enough of that, I think. Thank you. I mean, what does all this mean to you does not sound especially wicked, but okay, the kid is wicked, and I guess the reading is, what does this mean to you? I.e., why do you care that your ancestors were freed from slavery a long time ago? Bah. The Haggadah really lets the wicked son have it over the words, to you, and the idea that he's excluding himself from the family and the faith.
If yourself you don't consider as a son of Israel.
I feel there was probably a better way to respond to the wicked son's skepticism without flying into an angry snit and telling him he might as well be enslaved. Maybe if you treated him better, he wouldn't be so wicked. And more disturbing than any of this is the terrible lyric writing. Then did sneer the son so wicked? For this we got all dressed up? You might notice that up to this point, something we've done very little is telling the story of Passover. We broke a matzah in half, we ate our ancestors' tears, we talked about how important it is to tell the story, we shamed a child for not being interested in the story. Well, now, finally, here we go. The story. We would take turns reading, going around the table, but I'll summarize. You remember Isaac. He's the one who was almost murdered by his own father in a monstrous display of religious faith. I don't know if the trauma of that event made Isaac a simple son or a wicked one, but in a turn of events the Torah attributes to God and I attribute to sex, Isaac soon has 2 simple and wicked sons of his own, Jacob and Esau. Esau, who it may interest you to know is red, goes to Mount Seir and becomes the progenitor of the Edomites, a bunch of red people who later died. Jacob, meanwhile, becomes the progenitor of the Israelites, and he takes them down to Egypt, not to stay too long, but to look for farmable land while they wait out a famine in the land of Canaan. Cover the matzah, raise the cup of wine.
This promise made to our forefathers
And our foremothers.
holds true also for us. For more than once have they risen against us to destroy us. In every generation they rise against us and seek our destruction. But the Holy One, blessed be He, saves us from their hands.
And they did evil to us, and they made us suffer. They set upon us rigorous labor, and made us build the cities of Pithom and Ramses. They drowned our sons in the Nile. So we cried to the God of our ancestors, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the Eternal brought us forth from Egypt with a strong hand and an outstretched arm, and with great terror, and with signs and wonders. So now we have arrived at the Schadenfreude part of the evening, the terrible 10 plagues visited upon the Egyptians by God in furious anger over their treatment of the Israelites. We recite the plagues in unison, and for every plague, you put a finger in your cup and spill a drop of wine on your plate. Blood, frogs, vermin, wild beasts, pestilence, boils, hail, locusts, darkness, slaying of the firstborn. Yikes, that took a turn. Some of these plagues are kind of cute. You think you can enslave the Israelites? Well then, Mr. Pharaoh, you can just explain yourself to these frogs. Moses, who seems like a nice guy now, but will later become president of the National Rifle Association, keeps coming back and saying to this unspecified pharaoh, "Let my people go already." But that Yul Brenner, boy, is he difficult. And he keeps saying, "No, Moses, I will not let your people go." So the water turns to blood. There are vermin and locusts and wild beasts, also bad weather and boils. But the pharaoh won't give in. And so, what can an omnipresent, all-powerful, intervening God do but kill the firstborn son of every Egyptian family? In the witty and rollicking book of Exodus, God says,
About midnight I will go throughout Egypt. Every firstborn son in Egypt will die, and all the firstborn of the cattle as well. There will be loud wailing throughout Egypt, worse than there has ever been or ever will be again. That you may know that the Lord does make a difference between the Egyptians and Israel. On the 10th of this month, every man shall take for himself a lamb. And on the 14th day of the same month, you shall kill the lamb at twilight. And you shall take some of the blood and put it on the doorposts of your home. Then eat the lamb roasted in fire with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. And I'm not gonna say this again, no cream sauce! On that night, I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. Now the blood of the lamb shall be a sign on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you, get it, and the plague shall not destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt.
Everyone turn to page 19.
Wait. Now wait a minute. First of all, doesn't God know who's who? I mean, God really needs ovine innards strewn about the doorframe to indicate who deserves to live? Not a good system. What if the doorposts are already painted red and it's hard to see the blood? Does God notice at the last second?
Whoa! Bad color for doorposts. I almost killed your firstborn son because I didn't know you were Jewish. Because you've got red doorposts.
In some of this, God seems less upset about the abuse of the Israelites than the fact that the Egyptians don't believe in him. They have their own gods, whose existence is weirdly acknowledged by the Hebrew God when he says he will confront the gods of Egypt. How many gods we got here, anyway? At my family's seder, the 10th plague was nobody's favorite part of the evening. Someone at the table could always be relied upon to put in a word for all those firstborn Egyptians. And someone would make the point that spilling a drop of wine for each plague is a symbolic act of sympathy and sacrifice. All right. But it seems like every time we get to a problematic part of the seder, there's a big musical number. And this is the big hit from the Haggadah, a classic called Dayenu. It means it would have been enough. You see, as a people, we are simply wild about the past perfect conditional tense. There is a melody to the Hebrew verses of Dayenu, and whenever I hear it, I imagine a plucky, folky banjo accompaniment, because the version I know best was recorded by Pete Seeger in 1959 on the LP Folk Songs for Young People. It translates to, "There's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza." No. That verse means, had he fed us manna in the desert and not given us the Sabbath, it would have been enough for us. And then the chorus, starring Uncle Joe and company.
Da-da-yenu, 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 da-yenu, da-yenu.
We never sang the verses. We would go around the table reading it in English, which is, of course, a little rough. So my cousin Jenny says, had he divided the sea for us and not drowned our oppressors in it, it would have been enough for us.
Da-da-yenu.
And Uncle Joe favored a raucous, noisy Dayenu with a lot of banging on the table and hitting a plate with a spoon. This made Dayenu a real highlight of the Seder for those of us who are kids.
Da-da-yenu, 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 da-yenu, da-yenu.
Now my cousin Josh, had he drowned our oppressors in it and not helped us 40 years in the desert, it would have been enough for us.
Da-da-yenu, 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 da-yenu, da-yenu, da-yenu.
But set aside the biblical melodrama and listen to the poetry. This is a joyful expression of humility. If all we had was this good thing, and not all these other good things, it would have been enough for us. But what we have is more than enough. We are lucky, and we know it. Once the merriment has subsided, it's time to take a look at some of the other things on the Seder plate. Along with the parsley, we've got bitter herbs, horseradish, to remind us of the bitterness of slavery. Okay, charoset, a paste made from fruit, nuts, and wine or grape juice, and a little cinnamon and honey couldn't hurt, representing the mortar that Hebrew slaves used to make bricks. Charoset means clay. A shank bone, to remind us of the damn lamb whose blood we had to smear on our doorposts, because the Eternal One, blessed be He, has no idea what's going on. And an egg. This represents new life and the promise of breakfast. So, we have the second cup of wine, and then we eat bitter herbs and charoset on matzah. The Haggadah tells us that this is known as the Hillel sandwich. Hillel was a first-century Jewish thinker who said some wonderful things like,
That which is hateful to you, do not do unto your fellow.
That rings a bell, doesn't it? As well as his big hit,
If I am not for myself, who will be for me? And being for myself, what am I? And if not now, when?
And the rabbi said, he's on second, we're not talking about him. Hillel was apparently the inventor of this Seder sandwich. This really takes the wind out of the idea that the Earl of Sandwich invented the sandwich in 1762. For me, what's really interesting here is that Hillel was the first Jewish celebrity to have a sandwich named after him. Give me a Hillel, a Milton Berle, and a Myron Cohen. Now, I really have no memory of what we ate for dinner on Passover at the Brodys. I only remember the foods that represent the suffering of my ancestors. And I remember Aunt Sarah's matzo ball soup. We called it knedel soup. No matzo balls, no knedelach from a non-Sarah Brody kitchen have ever seemed quite right to me. After the meal and the wild afikoman antics, the Haggadah thoughtfully provides several more pages about how super-duper God is, but Uncle Joe, blessed be he in his great and infinite mercy, skips a lot of that. The Haggadah does have second act problems. But we get to it. We pour the third cup of wine, and we fill the big fancy cup in the middle of the table, and we open the door for Elijah. He is a prophet who appears in folklore as a kind of miracle worker and problem solver, like Harvey Keitel in Pulp Fiction. Putting out a cup of wine for him at the seder is supposed to be like insurance in the event of future hardship. Opening the door for Elijah was always fun when we were kids. Traces of Santa Claus, and there were always lots of funny jokes about how Elijah was running late, there was traffic, he shouldn't have taken I-95. Of course, we understood that this was a game, all in fun, and that after we all said goodnight and went home, someone was going to clear Elijah's cup of wine from the table and quietly pour it into the sink. The fourth cup of wine is poured amid another flurry of blessings, and then we have a little vaudeville where people can say whatever they want or ask questions or make comments or sing a song. Maybe somebody wants to tell a story or read something. I remember my cousin Jenny playing the flute. This is also when we would read one of those extra photocopied papers, one that always got my attention as the only part of the evening that concerned itself with relatively recent history. At the top of this typewritten page, it said, Passover, 1943. It's about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and how Jews were being carted away to the gas chambers every day and found ways to hold the Passover seder in secret using what meager things were available to them, and how we, always we, maintained our identity, even in the face of this dehumanizing persecution. In Warsaw, beginning on Passover 1943, a starving, outnumbered, poorly armed Jewish resistance fought back against the Nazis for 42 days. At one point, the resistance was so powerful that the Nazis temporarily retreated. They later returned in greater numbers, but as this wine-stained, typewritten document explained, a few hundred from the Warsaw Ghetto escaped through the underground sewer lines and joined anti-fascist groups in the woods and forests. And in the camps, too, there were countless acts of resistance. And then there were 6 lines of blank verse for the table to recite in unison, in the same style as the Haggadah.
We remember the heroism of the Jews, men, women, and children who fought in the ghettos, in the forests, on the war fronts, together with all of democratic humanity to stop the curse of fascism from engulfing the earth. We will honor their memory by dedicating ourselves to the cause of peace and freedom in our land and throughout the world.
This brought gravity and relevance to the story. Passover 1943 was real. It was not about explicating our crush on God or his on us. This aligned us with all oppressed people. It aligned us with democracy and against tyranny. It concerned events that had taken place within the lifetimes of the oldest people at the table. And it was about heroic human activity rather than a fantasy of cosmic intervention. I didn't realize this in 1980-something, but it's now obvious to me that while we went around the table in Bloomfield reading Passover 1943, Sarah and Red were thinking about our cousin Esther and her sisters and parents. And then there's that word ghetto. I heard it for the first time in this context, and associated it with European Jews long before I heard it used to describe the neighborhoods I've often lived in quite happily as an artist in New York City. Passover 1943 was important to my sense of solidarity with other minority groups in America, and a strong feeling instilled in me by my family that if you have a problem with them, you have a problem with us too. Also, lots of Americans are defensive and uncomfortable with the topic of slavery and do not want it to be talked about, including in history classes. So it's significant and laudable that Jewish families gather every year for a ceremony devoted to opposing this particular evil. This is Passover at its best, an anti-fascist festival, a celebration of liberation connected to an ongoing global cause. Some families add songs of Black liberation to the Seder repertoire, like We Shall Overcome, as well as Go Down Moses, a Black American spiritual that explicitly identifies with the Hebrew Exodus story, as well as the phrase, Let My People Go. Martin Luther King referenced the Passover story frequently. All of this not only makes the Seder more expansive and relevant, it also points to the similarities between Black and Jewish music, an affinity that is largely responsible for the Great American Songbook. Uncle Joe concludes the Seder with these words.
Ended is the Passover Seder, according to custom, statute, and law. As we were worthy to celebrate it this year, so may we perform it in future years. O pure one in heaven above, restore the congregation of Israel in your love. Speedily lead your redeemed people to Zion in joy.
And everyone says together,
Next year in Jerusalem.
Whatever.
When Israel was in Egypt land, let my people go.
So that's it. That's the Seder. My feelings about it have varied over the years. And now that I'm middle-aged, my feelings fall somewhere in the middle, between the best and worst of my earlier takes. I am impressed by the emphasis on asking questions. The Haggadah is full of contrasting viewpoints, a little bit like Tevye's monologues in Fiddler. This, but on the other hand, that. There are Talmud passages quoted in the Haggadah that recreate the debates among ancient rabbis about the meaning or technique of various practices, and even an argument about whether the phrase, all the days of your life, includes the nights, too. This spirit of inquiry is something I like about Jewishness and can also identify in Judaism. Maybe it's a genetic predisposition created by generations of religious practice. You know, back in the shtetl, there wasn't a question about whether or not to be religious. Religion permeated every detail of life and home. It was a lot like the internet. It was essential, it was everywhere, and it was full of misinformation. The synagogue was the religious but also the intellectual center of the community. Rabbi means teacher, and asking questions was encouraged. So yes, Judaism demands faith, which is something I can't give to it. But I don't think it would be fair to say it demands unquestioning faith. I remember being transfixed by the Seder. I remember being bored by it. I remember finding it beautiful and moving. I remember finding it onerous. I remember trying to determine the most authentic, originalist form of the Seder and trying to reconfigure it into something appropriate to a more enlightened time. At this point in my life, my strongest feelings about it are about family and fond memories. Sarah and Joe Brody could never convince me about God or Israel, but I sure would love to hear their voices again. My my feelings about Passover were dramatically altered when I was in my mid-30s. I was trying to write a musical comedy about Hebrew slaves in ancient Egypt. I realized that although I remembered the Haggadah pretty well, and I knew the Cecil B. DeMille version, I was not at all clear on the real history. A lifetime of seders, yet I knew almost nothing about the enslavement of the Hebrews, not even when it took place. So, okay, if we're going to write about this, when exactly were we slaves in Egypt? I thought this would be as simple as looking up a fact, like when you can't quite remember who Truman's vice president was, or what movie won the Oscar in 1982. And after some inquiry, I found that Truman's VP was Alban Barkley. Best Picture in '82 was Gandhi. And the early Hebrews were not slaves in Egypt, and the Exodus never happened. The study of archaeology in Israel was long guided by the desire to verify religious texts. 20th century excavations were conducted with a shovel in one hand and the Bible in the other. As science became more sophisticated, distant history became more knowable, and the overturning of dogma less unthinkable. The effort to correct the record was led by brave Israeli archaeologists who would have loved to discover evidence that supported biblical claims. But upon discovering the opposite, they understood that their responsibility was to the truth. Zev Herzog led the Department of Archaeology and Ancient Near Eastern Cultures at Tel Aviv University and served as advisor to Israel's Nature and National Parks Authority. In a famous article in Haaretz in 1999, Professor Herzog explained, sort of apologetically, that 70 years of intensive excavations in Israel had found that the early Israelites were never in Egypt, did not wander the desert, and adopted monotheism only in the waning period of the monarchy, and not at Mount Sinai. Most of those who are involved in scientific work, in the interlocking spheres of the Bible, archaeology, and history, and who once went into the field looking for proof to corroborate the Bible, now agree that the historic events are radically different from what the story tells. In 2013, a conference of, to quote the Biblical Archaeology Society, more than 40 of the world's leading archaeologists, biblical scholars, Egyptologists, historians, and geoscientists spent a week talking and debating and comparing their findings and could produce only the theoretical possibility that a small number of Semitic people could have been in Egypt and had personal experiences that were expanded into the Exodus story. Baruch Halpern is the Covenant Foundation Professor of Jewish Studies at the University of Georgia. Professor Halpern leans toward the Torah and differs with Herzog on several points. But even he says, the closest parallel to the book of Exodus in the ancient West is Homer's Odyssey, the historical myth of an entire people. Well, I have to tell you, it broke my heart to learn this. Even though I am a non-religious, non-spiritual, non-believer, this revelation that the early Hebrews were not slaves in Egypt and the Exodus never happened, hit me really hard. It stunned and saddened me. And to tell you the truth, I don't even like saying it now. But, to tell you the truth, I have to. I certainly have no investment in the Garden of Eden or Noah's Ark. You know this about me. I am not someone who cares about Bible stories or thinks they're true. So why do I feel so hurt by the understanding that we were slaves in Egypt is simply another myth? It's not that I had ever accepted the book of Exodus as an historical account, but I always had accepted that the early Hebrews were slaves in Egypt. that they escaped and crossed the desert. You know, the parting of the Red Sea doesn't seem true, but being slaves in Egypt, that did seem true, and it seemed important. From another angle, I think my emotional attachment to the Exodus story is Hitler's fault. To debunk the myth of the enslavement of the Israelites sounds uncomfortably similar to Holocaust denial. Just the sound of my own voice saying that didn't really happen seems terribly wrong. Seems, but isn't, because there's an important difference between the Exodus and the Holocaust. The Holocaust happened. There it is in all of its agony, so extensively recorded, so generous in its supply of awful artifacts, and so vividly remembered by its witnesses that its deniers are pariahs. So really, to compare the Exodus with the Holocaust is itself a kind of Holocaust denial. It treats these two stories equally, despite the veracity of one and the inaccuracy of the other. Obviously, the Exodus myth is not as dangerous a falsehood as Holocaust denial, but it's not without real-world implications. Even at my family's freewheeling lefty seder, I came away with the understanding that the Hebrews were good and the Egyptians were bad. I remember being 5 or 6 years old and hearing references to Egypt when my parents were watching the news, and thinking that was surprising and scary, as though Dan Rather were earnestly reporting on the activities of Darth Vader. For kids, the idea that Egypt equals evil can be an inadvertent lesson of Passover, and we ought to keep this in mind when we lament the fact that some Muslims are taught to hate Jews. It is heartbreaking to discover that bigotry is embedded in our origin myths. But there's also good news here. The premise of hate is fiction. My parents proposed that next year in Jerusalem could be a metaphor. Maybe in my heart, it's next year in Manhattan. So can the whole thing be allegorical? The problem is that the Passover story is told to kids. In many ways, it is for kids, and it concerns heroes and villains who exist as tribal and national identities in our own time. Maybe we can accept mythical tales of Hebrew heroism as a sort of pep talk. But how can we persist in smearing an entire country with a crime that never took place? Progressive attempts to, forgive me, leaven the story's morality, for instance by emphasizing that the Pharaoh is evil but not the Egyptian people who are also oppressed and want to be freed, that might help a little, but I feel a more thorough rewrite is in order. Since it's an imaginary story, let's pick an imaginary oppressor, one we will never encounter in reality. Like God, for example. Now we've got something. Let's rewrite the Exodus from Egypt as the Exodus from faith. We were slaves, but now we're free. Okay, if you don't like that idea, seriously, folks, I think we can figure this out. Even if the biblical Exodus story is not supported by the historical record, the Haggadah is not wrong when it says,
"In every generation they rise against us and seek our destruction."
the entire history, the real and verified history of the Jewish people, is the recurring story of finding some acceptance, peace, and freedom, and flourishing and thriving, and then being attacked, persecuted, deported, and murdered. The Assyrian conquest of Israel around 720 BCE forcibly relocated tens of thousands of Israelites. Whatever was left fell in the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem around 590 BCE. This began the Babylonian captivity of the Jews. There's a nice little period around the 160s BCE after the Maccabean revolt, Happy Hanukkah, and then a long period of being persecuted by the Romans. There's a brilliant golden age in Spain for a while, then a long period of intolerance, oppression, and finally, in that magical year of 1492, mass deportations. That kicks off a few centuries of being kicked around Eastern Europe, followed by a pleasant little respite in the Polish countryside, and then the Pale of Settlement and the pogroms, then very nice in the Weimar Republic in the 20s, and then the Holocaust, and hey, here we are, folks. I mean, if we want an annual holiday that celebrates freedom from tyranny and illustrates that theme with true stories from our history, we have a lot to work with. Our responsibility to the truth requires that we think critically about God and religion. But after many years of feeling so betrayed by the Exodus story, and so separate from all of it, that I really had no desire to celebrate Passover, I suddenly feel now that we also have a responsibility to our ancestors, who suffered so terribly for simply waking up Jewish in the morning and trying to live freely as Jews. And in their honor, I think we should try to live freely as Jews, however we think we can, whatever we think it means. I am working on it. You know, adapting and revising this stuff is also a tradition. Customs should be customized. There are a million Haggadahs out there representing a million approaches. Here's a thought from the preface to the 1908 Union Haggadah. The seder is priceless. We would suffer an irretrievable loss were it allowed to pass into neglect. In carrying on the circle of piety that links the generations, it is necessary frankly to face and honestly to meet the needs of our own day. The old Haggadah, while full of poetry, contains passages and sentiments wholly out of harmony with the spirit of the present time. Whatever your seder turns out to be, please stop the relentless personalizing of mythical suffering. The book wags a bony finger in your face and says, never forget that you were a slave. And now we eat things that taste terrible to remind us that Egypt was terrible and no bread for a week. You want to know why? Egypt. That's why. Because we were slaves in Egypt. No, we weren't. We should stop saying we were. And if we want to celebrate the remarkable survival of our people, we're the last people who need to pad our resume. We can look back on the suffering, oppression, and persecution Jewish people have endured and say, it would have been enough for us.
Sing da-da-ye-nu, sing da-da-ye-nu, and with da-ye-nu, you'll find your way to happiness. Just sing da-ye-nu and shout da-ye-nu, because da-ye-nu is good enough for me. If today you're feeling healthy, even though you're not so wealthy, if you're healthy, then you're wealthy, da-ye-nu. If you want to love another, even though he's not your brother, love another, call him brother, da-ye-nu. Sing da-da-ye-nu, sing da-da-ye-nu, and with da-ye-nu, you'll find your way to happiness. Just sing da-ye-nu and shout da-ye-nu, because da-ye-nu is good enough for me.
Thanks for listening to Part 3 of Pintala, a 7-part series. I'm happy to say that the Pintala Haggadah is now available at noahdiamond.com/Pintala. The Pintala Haggadah is a concise, modern Haggadah written and illustrated by me, pointing the way forward to a Passover celebration of liberation, free of religious dogma or historical inaccuracy, with enough space in the margins to make it your own. I hope you'll consider buying a copy of the Pintala Haggadah and incorporating it into your Passover tradition, or using it to start one. The beautiful music you're listening to right now is Dayenu, performed by the Burton sisters, with Sam Medoff, also known as Dick Manning, and his orchestra. Other music heard in this episode includes Dayenu, recorded by cantor David Putterman, Kiddush by cantor Edgar Mills and the Oheb Shalom Quartet, Manishtana by the Orchestra da Camera and the Zimra Quartet, and Mazel Tov by Emil Stern. You also heard Brookline Chairlift by Steve Rice, Jewish Comedians by Alon Marcus, Go Down Moses performed by the Andy Warner Band, and other selections licensed from the Pond 5 Media Collection. Zev Herzog is quoted from Deconstructing the Walls of Jericho, Haaretz, 1999. Baruch Halpern is quoted from The Exodus from Egypt, Myth or Reality, from The Rise of Ancient Israel. Notes and links to these and other resources, and a comments thread where you can express your opinion about this episode, can be found at noahdiamond.com/Pintala.